welcome all to our June installment of the SEJ webinar series, which is being hosted as part of the Guyana Extractives Industry Transparency Week. Today, our discussion will focus on investigating extractives industries. And we have a very experienced panel led by Sarah Schoenhart, international climate reporter at ENE News, as well as an SEJ board member. Just a few quick notes before we begin. A disclaimer that the Society of Environmental Journalists is a nonpartisan, non-advocacy educational organization. Sponsorship of this educational program does not constitute implied or actual endorsement by SEJ of any person, business, government, or organization, or their products, services, advertising, messages, or opinions. And the views expressed by the speakers here today will be their own. A couple of logistical notes as well. Please find a moment, or please take a moment to find the Q&A box at the bottom of the Zoom window. We are going to use that Q&A box to communicate our questions to the panelists today. Please reserve the chat box for posting helpful links or resources. And if you do post questions in the chat, note that we'll just be asking you to place them in the Q&A box. Another note that this webinar is being recorded and will be available online within hopefully a few business days. And with that, I'll go ahead and hand things off to Sarah and we'll get started.
Thanks, McKenna. Welcome everyone. I'm really excited to be moderating this panel. We have a great lineup of speakers to share their experiences covering extractive industries, which I think, as we all know, are a very difficult topic to cover and also really vital for particularly environmental issues and concerns. So among the panelists today is David Abel. He's a producer, director, and cinematographer whose recent film Entangled looks at the efforts to protect the North Atlantic right whales from extinction. We also have Gustavo Faleros, an environmental investigations editor at the Rainforest Investigations Network, which is part of the Pulitzer Center, and Carla Mendez, contributing editor for Manga Bay, who's done some really important investigative work around the Brazilian rainforest. So I wanted to kick us off, I think, with a question first to Gustavo, who has worked on an interesting sort of data satellite imagery project, a series of stories looking at illegal mining in the Venezuelan Amazon. There was this story that kind of kicked this whole project off, and I noticed in the beginning there's a bit of a preface to the story that talks about what the reporter experienced doing the work for this piece. And it says that the reporter was confronted by illegal armed groups, met indigenous communities, were oppressed by Colombian guerrillas, and enclaves of informal miners tormented by malaria. He was also detained by the National Guard. I think that underscores some of the challenges that reporters face covering extractive industries. Often these are areas that are patrolled by military forces, supported by powerful politicians. I was hoping you could kick us off by talking about the reporting that went into this project, some of the considerations that you and the reporters weighed in doing the reporting, and the security concerns you have to deal with as a reporter when trying to report on these industries.
Thanks, Sarah. Hello, everyone. Hello, my fellow panelists here. Yeah, thanks for this first question. I think digging into the mining arc, the first of a series of investigative pieces in the Venezuelan Amazon, it was a big collaborative effort. So we started this story by just being in contact with some local journalists from a newspaper called Correo del Caroní in the state of Bolivar in Venezuela. And that was in 2016 when they had recently covered a massacre in a city of their state. And no one was really linking that massacre with a new law that was passed by the national government of Venezuela. And one friend called Oscar Murillo, Murillo, he he called me and said, like, you know, this is linked to this new announcement of a number of concessions in the Amazon of Venezuela. So what happened, what we discovered, was that massacre was caused by the dispute of illegal miners with kind of armed groups that were trying to control the mines before the government started the concessions. And so that kind of kicked the instinct that we should tell that story about the mining arc, which is a huge area that was kind of put apart by the government to concessions to national companies or international companies. So what we decided to do is put an international team. So that the reporter that was on the ground is called Bran Ebbas, is a Dutch national based in Colombia and with a lot of knowledge of working in Venezuela. So he was the one covering on the ground and working together with this team of Venezuelan journalists. At the same time, you mentioned the work with maps and satellite imagery. We made an effort on our team of InfoAmazonia to guarantee that we would understand how those concessions were divided, you know, like the blocks of mining to be conceded and how this was overlapping with the indigenous lands. So the story is complex because there's all these actors involved. But it was tense moment when Bran was there and was really arrested by the National Guard when we was visiting some of these mines. So I think that if I can leave some learning from now, that it was very important to have all these partners on the ground, both the local journalists and the indigenous people that was not only sources, but somehow partners guiding us on that territory. And that guarantees also that Bran was safe. So he stayed arrested for 2 days. This is a bit of how it worked. But then we keep doing investigations in that area. And over the years, we published 2 more of this in big pieces in showing the connections of the illegal mining with the markets in the US and Europe as well. We can hear, sorry.
Sorry, David, you've also done some really deep investigations into some very, I think, knotty issues. Can you talk about how you prepare for those stories? What goes into the I guess, the background research, but also the preparation in terms of your own safety and how you plan to conduct interviews and other things during the work that you're doing?
I like that, naughty. That's all that's all I focus on. You know, every story is different, and you know, not all of it involves wading into combat zones or something like that. I think what's relevant to talk about is I think the work I've done as a reporter for the Boston Globe and as a filmmaker with our fishing industries here in New England. So where I live, which is Boston, we have a growing conflict between what is the arguably most quickly warming body of water on the planet, the Gulf of Maine, here off of the coast of New England, and these iconic historic industries that essentially is what helped found this country, the United States. It's what brought settlers here centuries ago. And for generations, many families along the coast here have made a living from fishing, whether it's fishing for an iconic species like cod or lobster, or many other species. That has been an integral part of our history and our economy. It's so much so that here in Massachusetts, in Boston, in the legislature, the state legislature, there's a wooden cod that hangs from the rafters of our legislature as a symbol of what essentially helps establish and brought great wealth to our region. Except now, and in recent years, while fishing pressure has been a big problem, overfishing has been a big problem for generations, now you throw into the equation the accelerating warming of the Gulf of Maine and the surrounding waters. And that has introduced a whole new and difficult equation where we now have increasing conflicts between efforts to sustain our economy and efforts to sustain this vital ecosystem. And so I've made 3 films over the last few years. One was about the how the federal government put a moratorium on cod fishing and banned commercial cod fishing some years ago, because after many years of overfishing, the fish didn't bounce back and they fell to what was considered 4% of what would constitute a sustainable population for that iconic fishery. And that was when the federal government imposed the shutdown on this cod fishery, which is what brought the settlers, the Pilgrims, sustain themselves off of this fishery, as did families for generations here. It suddenly caused devastation across the coastline throughout New England. And then we've seen my next film in this genre was called Lobster War, and that was about how climate change is also affecting this other iconic industry, which is the most valuable industry, most valuable fishery in North America. And we have seen a 90% decline in the lobster catch south of where I live in Massachusetts, which has been devastating and caused many people to lose their livelihoods and their ways of life. But on the flip side, we've seen a surge in the population of lobster in further to the north. And the film that I made called Lobster War focuses on how that huge boom in the population has led to this conflict between the United States and Canada over this island that both countries have claimed since the end of the Revolutionary War. But nobody really cared about until suddenly the waters around this island were suddenly flush with lobster. And that created this, this competition between the Canadians, who long ceded these waters to the Americans, and then all of a sudden they became crowded, and then there was sabotage and so forth. So that's why we titled that film Lobster War. And then while I was making that film, I learned about the conflicts between the lobster industry and one of the world's most endangered species, this iconic species called the North Atlantic right whale. And there are now roughly about 350 of them left, and their population has declined by 25% just in the past decade. And the primary cause for their decline has been entanglements in the fishing gear used by the lobster industry. And they are some 85% of right whales have scars from entanglements, and it often either kills them quickly or kills them slowly. So this is just the films that I've been working on, and there are all kinds of challenges trying to get information and get people to talk to you and not come across as a threat to them, and try to tell thoughtful, balanced, nuanced stories that look at fairly, the economic impacts that our efforts to try to avert the problems that climate change bring, as well as our efforts to try to deal with the problems that climate change. And so threading the needle between commercial and conservation interests has been the focus of my work, but I'll stop there and allow you to proceed.
Thanks. I think that's a really important point that we can come back to, just about sourcing and getting sources to speak with you, and the challenges that come with that around these really sensitive stories. But I'd like to go to Carla, because you've done quite a lot of reporting looking at deforestation and water contamination caused by, I think in air quotes, sustainable palm oil in the Brazilian Amazon. And your investigations have actually been used by federal prosecutors to make complaints, to make companies accountable and to really raise this issue to a broader political scale. Can you talk a little bit about the impacts this reporting have had? I think as journalists, we always look to see how our coverage is being received, and it'd be great to hear how that has played out for this type of work you've done.
Sure. No, thank you so much for the question, Sarah. Hello, everyone. Yeah, this is, I can say that was the most complex and the longer work I've done in my almost 20-year career so far. And it lasted 18 months to come up with the piece. And it was really surprised in so many ways because, first of all, almost nobody talks about palm oil in Brazil. We hear a lot in Southeast Asia and all the damages there. But then when I received this tip of this story, I said, what? Palm oil? Then I was really curious and started digging deeper. The first tip I had is about land grabbing, which is still a second part of the investigation that will come up in the third quarter, mostly likely. And then as I started digging deeper, I found, I can say, a show of several wrongdoing in a range of wrongdoing, because they had problems with water contamination, indigenous communities, quilombola communities, many traditional communities. And then as I started talking to prosecutors, I saw that there was a long fight that lasted 7 years, that prosecutors were trying to make the companies accountable. Because just for you to have an understanding, the Brazilian government launched a program of sustainable palm oil around 10 years ago. And then it started to bring palm oil plantations to Pará state in the Amazon region. And with the promise of it's green for biodiesel, a lot of things. And palm oil is so present in our life, we don't realize that they use it for hygiene products, beauty products, chocolate, cookies, whatever. And so it was another thing that I started looking at it. And although, of course, the main drivers of deforestation in the Amazon, if you look at the extent, is cattle, mining, agriculture in general, and then palm oil just accounts for about 1%. Brazil just accounts for 1% of the global production. It's making serious inroads for them. So when I visited the area of the indigenous people around palm oil plantations, I was really surprised because it looked like green islands, all surrounded by palm oil. There is not any buffer zone around it. So we saw the palm oil plantations just a few meters from them. And I found academic research proving water contamination linked to palm oil plantation there. And it's from 2016, 2016, 17, even the government, a federal laboratory did research itself, founding that, and nothing happened. So it really intrigued me. And then on the way of this investigation, I found out also problems with the license problems, with something that's really under discussion in Brazil. The government is trying to ease environmental requirements to approve development projects. They are trying to just allow, the self-licensing, things like that. And the palm oil case is really an example about the damage that what can happen if it's approved, because in the palm oil case, because there is laws and a lot of things that protect indigenous areas, but then there are loopholes in the Brazilian legislation that allowed that palm oil plantations to close to indigenous reserves. And more than that, the Pará state government, they claim that palm oil plantation is not harm to the health, because it's tree, they are planting trees. So theoretically, they are planting these trees over previously deforested land. But what you saw in reality, that's not true, because satellite imagery showed that some areas were cleared for palm oil plantations. And pesticides. They use a lot of pesticides in the crops that go directly to the water. And these people, we heard several cases of people having allergies and even cancer. I experienced myself when I was on the ground, was in front of one of the palm oil mills that's really just a few meters from the river. And I look at that and thought, how that can happen? And in front of that palm oil mill, there were some palm oil plantations. When I was close to them and inhaled the fumes from those palm oils, I started coughing, had a cries of coughing. I had to get into the car. I couldn't withstand that. I was thinking how people could withstand working with that. And then after we published the piece, the prosecutors told me that they are using, in their ongoing lawsuit against the companies to make them accountable. And they were also preparing a new lawsuit because another problem is the legal system. Is everything too slow? They're trying to do an in-depth study to monitor during a year how the hydrological cycle in the Amazon and collect samples of water to prove the existence of the pesticides. And the judge just said that, no, but you can do this, when you have the trial of the merit, there is no urgency to do that. And in the meantime, people are dying. So we are really hopeful that this investigation can really help them to do this forensic report, improve that, and make the companies accountable, because their marketing is that they are sustainable, they are green, and in fact, we saw on the ground that they are not.
Yes, I think an indication of the importance of this type of reporting. Gustavo, I'm curious if you can talk about the medium and the way that you've packaged the reporting that you've worked on. You use a lot of data and mapping, there are visuals, the projects have video, there's a lot of interactive elements to them. How important is the way that these stories are framed visually and including these different elements for, I guess, readers to have a better sense of the overall picture?
Thanks, Sarah. Yeah, in all these reports, the digging into the mining arc, the second one is called the Venezuela's Smuggler's Paradise, and the most recent one is about the mercury trade. We adopt the same kind of a model, which is kind of a multimedia reporting, where while you read, because the texts are very long, and I'm not saying this is bad or quite the contrary. So the text needs to be long because the topics are very complex. But to make this more palatable, what we do is, like, while you're reading the text, you tag parts of this with pictures and many other materials. It's not a very new technique, of course, like just putting pictures to contextualize the story. But what we do as well is, like, if you're reading about this place, you get access to a map with the data about the mining concession of that place. So it's not just like an overall map of the area that we are reporting, like this is happening in this part of Venezuela, but being very specific sometimes about one protected area, one mining concession, and using data in that sense, establishing a dialogue between data and the content. And that's possible because of the interactivity possibilities of doing multimedia reporting. So for specific, the two very first stories that I saw the links were shared, a new theme was developed by the tech guys of InfoAmazonia. They did a great work of, while you're scrolling, you get this elements popping up as you can see the two happening at the same time. So if I'm mentioning a source, at the same time you get a picture or a video of that person at the same time. So you can dig more if you want to actually hear the full interview in a video. And so that's how we've been doing. And that's to say that these stories that we're talking here, the extractive industry stories, they have a common feature that are complexity. Like I think all the stories I heard from David or from Carla, they're all very complex, involved several actors, several locations even, and countries, and like supply chains that are connecting one country with other continents. So for doing this, I think using all kind of medium is very helpful. For the last project, the one in the Mercury one, we also done for the first time a documentary. So this documentary is about to be launched on the Mercury problems in the Guyana Shield. It's going to be launched in partnership with Vice. And I think this is a great medium as well. I'll leave for David to explore more. But for kind of a packing the story for a larger audience, and then sometimes inviting the same audience to go and explore further in a platform with text and data and maps and things like that.
Great, thank you, Gustavo. There's a question that came into the question and answer box, and it's actually one that I had hoped David could answer. So you mentioned some of the challenges with getting sources to speak, whether it's an industry source or perhaps someone who is worried about their own security. You know, everyone has various reasons for being reluctant, I think, to speak to reporters and others. Can you talk about both the challenges and then how you've worked to overcome the sort of barriers to getting sources to speak openly?
Sorry about that. Thanks for the question. So first of all, I would say that it's in the interest of any subject to be skeptical of anyone who wants to put a microphone in their face or a camera or whatever it is. You know, you never know what the agenda is of a reporter who is going to be asking you questions. And I think it's always wise for a subject to flesh out what are you hoping to get from this interview? What is the purpose of you asking me questions and so forth? And from my point of view as the reporter or the filmmaker, it's to try to be as transparent as possible so that folks understand this is what I'm trying to do. This is the film I'm making. This is the story I'm writing. And this is why I want to talk to you. And these are the questions that, you know, I would like to ask you about. And my hope is that transparency and also the body of work that I've done, and sometimes sharing that with a source might help ease their concerns about, you know, what I'm trying to do, and that I don't approach my journalism or my films with an agenda as much as being probative and curious and trying to understand the subject in as much depth as I possibly can. At the same time, sometimes, you know, there are challenges that go beyond just getting people to speak, particularly with the films, you know, getting people to speak clearly without obfuscation, directly, and hopefully emotively, especially when it's on camera, is important. And this is especially a challenge when talking to academics and scientists, which is something I've done quite a bit of for the films I've made. And sometimes when there's conflicts that the film is looking at, that looks at sort of, you know, these people who are incredibly passionate, who have this history behind them, and whose livelihoods are at risk, and their families, you know, are worried about losing their homes or you know, not having enough food to put on the table. It's hard to sometimes balance those deep and reasonable and easy to understand and appreciate concerns with things like, well, the planet is warming, and, you know, our biodiversity is declining, and we need to do something about that. And so sometimes when I speak to scientists and they speak about studies and models and speak in very over the top, hard to understand language, I need to sort of look at them and say, you need to speak in lay terms and speak in a way that people can understand. So there are a host of challenges, but I think it all comes down to being honest, direct, transparent, and putting your cards on the table so people know what it is you're trying to do, and hopefully, if they see the wisdom of that and they trust you, they'll be willing to speak to you.
Great, thank you. I have a similar question for Carla, but you've reported in some very sensitive areas with people who may not only not want to speak openly, but may be worried about their safety. And what responsibility do journalists have to work with those sources and protect them? And how do you navigate that really sensitive line?
Yeah, thanks for the question. And that's really a concern that I always try to take in mind wherever I'm talking about this, especially because I think Gustavo and David have faced many situations covering this, because we go to these areas and we come back home, but these people are still there. So we do need to think about their lives and not putting them at risk. And then sometimes, even when the person is talking, on the record, I ask, is that okay? Using it with your name, because sometimes I think people, they don't realize the risk they're facing. And there are some cases, for example, as they mentioned about video, I think videos, it's even more challenging because that's their faces there. It's just the name, they get some anonymity. And although I'm a writer, I've done some films as well. And as with the multimedia, as Gustavo mentioned, this palm oil piece, it was a 10,000 word, the longest of my life, and one of the longest at Monga Bay, I think. So we also had video on there because we know people love video and they can really see with their own eyes how the place looks like, this kind of thing. And not all people want to be on camera. And in some cases for the palm oil video we did, for example, one of the sources who recorded, gave us an interview on camera afterwards, he was really concerned, he was receiving death threats and asked us to not use him, and we respect that because you understand. So we do need to have these concerns in mind. And of course, to also think about our own safety, because many of these places, they are dangerous. And then usually what I do is to do as much research as I can before going there, talking to leaders, and even to show to these people that they can trust us because they are under attack all the time. So, so they have their reasons to not trust you. So for the palm oil investigation and also for the documentary film I did into illegal logging in the Amazon, it's been months of negotiations with them, showing samples of work, the purpose of work. And for some areas I needed to take, for example, flak jackets, bulletproof helmets. When I did a documentary film into illegal logging, I was really scared of going there, but I said I need to go. And we faced some situations where, I saw that a conflict could happen. And I experienced, even in living those areas, hearing shootings, and having seen motos trying to falling after our cars. And in the timber, the documentary film, for example, one of which was about the Guardians of the Forest, which is a group of Guarajara indigenous who fight themselves, they risk their lives to fight illegal logging. It's an area where there is no enforcement at all. And 6 months after we released the film, one of the guardians was murdered in an ambush. So, the things, and it's real sensitive issues, it's challenging, but at the same time we need to cover. We know that giving voice to them is one of the best ways to protect them as well. So it's a tough balance to have there is no straightforward questions for all investigations. Each case is different.
Just to pick up on a point you made about this being one of the longest, perhaps, projects that Manga Bay has supported. How do you go about getting buy-in for an investigation like this from editors?
Yeah, no, it was a really the longest, I think, this, and there was another one that I'm finishing as well, that of course coincided with the pandemic and all these things that you need to challenge. But Manga Bay really gave me the support. I had the support from other editors. I was somehow lucky of having, I went to the Pará State in November 2019, and then the pandemic came, it started here in March. So on one hand, we are lucky because we have the footage, we have, all the information from the ground, and having the material to really have a powerful material to release without the need to go to the ground. And as Gustavo mentioned, it's really, really complex. Many times I thought I was done, then I found another piece. No, but how this license works? No, but there is not a match. Then I had to keep going to have the best information as possible. And of course, after that, to put together this whole piece was another challenging, because having a book, I think material to write a book or something, how to come up with a piece. So and Manga Bay covers palm oil a lot in Southeast Asia. I think is one of the reference for doing this coverage. And then they said, no, let's do it in Brazil. Let's give the support. So I did have editorial support as a contributing editor. I edited and a report. And for a couple of months, I was completely into this without the daily breaking news. It's something really crazy here in Brazil. Things happening all the time. The government trying to change measures, to allow mining in protected areas, this kind of thing. So, and it really paid back, as you could see the impacts, as prosecutors using it, other outlets picking up, and other outlets keep reaching me, asking to talk to them about the investigations. And I think that for Guyana, for example, I think that's a topic that may be a good investigation for them, because after talking to some people there, I think the situation is somehow similar to Brazil, that there is, an industry, it's not that prominent, but there were, rumors that they're trying to revive that. So I think that's really something they should keep an eye on this.
Thanks, Carla. I want to turn to a couple of questions from the panelists now. The first one we have comes from Laura Peterson. She's asking if the panelists could share some of the most important and useful documents, both US and internationally, for investigating and finding background information about corporations that you're looking into.
I think a lot of the information about trade that is not actually totally open. I think there is good information that is under some kind of a paywalls today. So we've seen that's worth paying for, using tools like Panjiva and Port Genius that have the records of trade and companies sending some of these commodities and minerals to from developing countries and the main markets in the US and in Europe. So other tools are doing, because every country has their own structure to, like to communicate the corporate structure, so the shareholders or the brands of a company. But there are tools specifically we're using on this new network that I'm working on. One is called Sayari, which is interesting, but there are others who does kind of the same thing. But what they do is bringing all their shareholders, the brands, and sometimes they also aggregate what kind of a watch list these companies are. For example, if they committed some environmental crimes in some countries, depends on the jurisdiction of each company, you would get this kind of information. So I would say that if you think as a company as an entity that you can add several layers, you can get the basic information, for example, on Open Corporates. It's an interesting website that has some good information in terms of like, these are the shareholders, and this is the jurisdiction of this company, and then you can go into each country and start saying like, is there environmental fines? Is there like any kind of a judicial open information that you can attach to that company? Another interesting tool, which is fairly open, is Aleph from OCCRP, and also allows you to just bump into some names and corporates that it will show you like, are these, for example, are these names found in any of the lakes of offshores or the Luxembourg lakes, because those are the American cables, so you can try to find other layers of information linked to those corporates. That would be more like not specific documents, because you can get, for example, the tax returns of companies in the US or non-profits, and see what is are the sources of funds of a non-profit, for example. But then there's several other layers, as I said, that you should try to connect, and that varies from country to country. It's more, what I was trying to say is like, it's more the process than the specific documents.
Mm. Yeah, certainly. David, I don't know if you had any other thoughts you wanted to add about finding information.
Sorry. Well, I think it's difficult to share that kind of information, because in some ways it depends on the country and where you're reporting from. So in the States, we have a federal and individual state rules called the Freedom of Information Act. And so there are federal requirements that you can, when a journalist or anyone from the public solicits information from a federal government agency, the government is required to respond within a period of time. And that process sometimes works and sometimes doesn't work so well. And then every state has or not every state, but most states have their own Freedom of Information Act or public record request laws. Ours in Massachusetts is not quite as progressive, surprisingly, as certain other states, and so it's not always easy. The one document that I would mention, or the one database that I would mention, somewhat similar to what Gustavo was talking about, is GuideStar, and that is a source of information on nonprofit organizations. I don't know if it extends beyond the United States, but you can find out all kinds of things about who runs these nonprofit organizations, how much they are paid, what their job titles are, and some other basic information. So that would be one other resource I would suggest.
Great, thank you all. We have another question about working and collaborating with journalists, especially journalists based in developing countries who are living close to conflict zones. This might be a good question for you to answer, Gustavo, given your work with the Rainforest Investigation Network. What steps do you recommend to ensure that when you're working with journalists in countries where they might be in danger from collaborating on these projects, that they can be safe from harm, and how do you work in a collaborative nature with journalists across borders?
Yeah, well, first and foremost, I'm learning a lot now with this work, and a new policy also that we see the Policy Center trying to implement is ending with this word fixer, which is kind of treating someone like, oh, this is just a fixer. No, this is a local reporting partner. So it has kind of same status, and so it means that it gets the byline and works it with kind of a same measure of precautions of the journalists of the main outlet. I think this is an ethical thing that brings a lot to the local reporting partners. But in practical terms, I think there's a need of keeping an attention with these local reporting partners after it is published, because sometimes even if they're not getting a byline because they didn't ask to be quoted because of the risk, there are identified. I mentioned this because we had a situation like this in one of these reports where the local reporting partner was identified by one of the companies that was mentioned, and it started to be pressured. It's like, you were the one working with these guys, we were accusing us of doing something. And so what we did, it was taking the step and say, like, look, if you're having problems with the reports, it's not about this guy, it's about us. You should talk with us. We are the responsible, so we assume the whole responsibility for the project. And that was something I would say like this. I mean, the same measures that apply for the stars of the shows also apply for the local reporting partners.
Great. I don't know if any of the other panelists had questions or had answers to that question about working with other reporters involved in collaborative reporting projects. Okay, I'm gonna try, this is a question about tracking Exxon using tax certificates. I guess more broadly, looking into the finances and the financial sheets of large corporations like Exxon and others can be quite tricky. Do the panelists have any tips for reporters about how they can uncover some of these issues around where money is going related to big corporations?
I can take that. Yeah, I know that many journalists, are kind of bored of working with this balance sheets, this kind of thing, but it's really, really important to follow the money and try to understand the flow, especially because when we are talking about the extractive industries, it's really key to track the entire supply chain. And so, I came from a business background, so I was a business reporter before becoming environmental one, and I found that really useful because if you look at the balance sheets of the companies, you can have a lot of information, because especially if it's listed, the company has to communicate investments, disclose a lot of information about what they are doing and even about the risks. If there is a big lawsuit about them, they have to allocate some money, for this kind of thing. So it's really important to keep an eye on this. It can be challenging, but I know that many journalism organizations, they promote any workshops, to help journalists to work with data and finance. And adding to that, completing a bit something from the previous questions, lawsuits. It's a really interesting thing to keep an eye out on that, because many information that are not available publicly, if there is a lawsuit against a company and if you get access to that, the company has to provide that information. And so if the process is public or if you get it through the investigator in the case, you can have a lot of information about that. So and academic researchers as well. There are a lot of knowledge that's completely buried in university. In this palm oil case, for example, it's one of them. Many studies proving there were contamination that nobody wrote about that. And even, for example, there was a case that I was really trying to get the last piece of the license process in Pará State. And I couldn't get the environmental licensing, despite requesting many times to the government. And I got that through one academic researcher who had that document shared with me. And then from that, I could see, the absolute things that are happening there, that they just issuing the license without requiring any compensation or setting up any limitation for the company.
I would just add and say that this is a really difficult problem, I think, for a lot of reporters. When you're dealing with a public entity, it's, at least in the United States, it's easier to get information, and there's an obligation on the part of the agency to provide information. That often is not the case with many private companies. They do have requirements to provide certain information, but it's challenging. I can think of one story I've been covering here in New England quite a bit, not the fishing industry, but the biomass industry. And the biomass industry is basically these power plants that use wood and trees essentially to burn them for energy and for heat. And one of we've got all kinds of requirements here in Massachusetts, where I live, about what companies could qualify for state subsidies to get to be able to sell energy at subsidized to sell energy and be able to, I guess, get incentives for that. The problem is that the requirements make it very difficult to have accountability for. So they say that the wood that is used for these kinds of power plants have to come from sustainably sourced forests or something to that effect. But the problem is that a lot of these power plants that are burning this wood, it's unclear where they come from, and they come from out of state, and it's really hard to track them. So I wish we had a better and easier way to do that.
Thanks, David and Carla. Coming to a question about data journalism, I think there's a question in the Q&A about how one would sort of begin down the path of data journalism and how to use data to make information accessible to an audience. This probably goes to a point David made earlier about translating some of the responses you get from the science and research side into kind of applicable real life experiences. So how can journalists take some of this really weighty information they're getting through the course of their investigations and put that into a story in a way that is really relevant to an audience?
I think there are two answers to this question. One, of course, is what a lot of people like about data journalism, that it allows nice visualizations and nice applications, which means like new and innovative ways of showing the information. So either through a map or through like a way of exploring information. There are so many examples and of this and in the past years. But the other thing, so the other approach to this is not really caring so much about the final result in terms of visuals or presentation, but how you get interesting information. I like to think about the image of a diamond. It's really like digging into a lot of, information and finding that really precious information out of the data, of the quantity of the data. And for that, you can either adopt a scientific mindset or partner with scientists. And what I mean by having a scientific mindset is like, do you have a hypothesis, like maybe shall we look at this huge amount of documents and find something, and then you start creating a methodology, and you make this methodology and how you're doing this research clear to your audience. And that has a lot of appeal. For example, years ago, we decided to investigate if the Brazilian government was really investing on combating the deforestation. And for that, we had to analyze 8 years of federal budget. Very unappealing, not very sexy to spend a lot of time looking at budgets and of several ministries. But the one information that we found is like there was really a drop of 72% of the investment. And so that's the diamond. out of 8 years of data, 72% was the real number that still stick. And up to this day, sometimes on Twitter, there's someone like using that 72% to prove a point or something. Not always something that we agree, but it shows that, you know, is the diamond really, is the news piece.
I would answer that question by saying everyone should hire Gustavo because he's so good at this. and having someone to collaborate with like Gustavo is super helpful. As I mentioned, I think before we began speaking, Gustavo was helped me with my most recent film, Entangled, and he taught a class here in Boston. And I think his students might have helped a little bit with this project, but you know, it's vital data to back up any story, but trying to figure out how to present it in a way that is easy to apprehend and clear and relevant is why it takes someone like Gustavo to help. And so for me, when I've made a bunch of these films, I wear a lot of hats, and I'm often holding the camera and asking the questions and wearing the headphones to do the recording. But I'm also creating graphics and trying to figure out how, as the story producer, I'm trying to figure out how do I convey something really complicated in a very straightforward, simple way. And just like Gustavo said, you know, where you have to spend, you know, a long time looking at the minutia of a budget, we, you know, have spent lots of time over the years, you know, looking at minutia, trying to find something that will help distill a complicated subject that you're talking about into simple explanations. Sometimes as a filmmaker, that means creating an animation and showing, for example, like, you know, how a right whale survives off of this, which is the size of a school bus, how they manage to survive off of a creature the size of a grain of rice. And, you know, there's a lot of people who can speak to that, but showing it visually, whether it's in an animation or whether it's in a graphic of some other kind, like a motion graphic, is vital to telling a story.
Great. Finding the gems and not doing it alone. I think those are two good takeaways to leave us with. Before we go, I just want to introduce Rina Guntutz. Forgive me if I pronounced that wrongly. She's the chief of party at the Pan American Development Bank, and she's going to just talk briefly about some small grant programs for journalists. Over to you, Rina.
I will. Thank you very much. This has been extremely informative, and I thank you for such a wonderful presentation to all the presenters. We have some very exciting things going on in our project, the Guyana Extractive Sector Transparency Project, and one of those is a small grants program that we're running. We're running a small grants program for civil society organizations, but also for journalists. And what we're hoping is that we will have, based on all these exciting discussions and stimulating information, we'll hopefully have some Guyanese journalists that will be interested in participating in our small grants program. The information for the small grants program can be found on the website where you registered. And if you take a look there, you'll see the information, the guidelines, and contact details. So please feel free and contact us. The other thing I just want to point out as well is that we have on that page as well in the website, you'll notice that we have a series of pieces of information. It's a transparency portal. And what we've done is we've tried to amass as much information that we possibly could in regards to the extractive sector. So, yeah, just pointing out things. If you are searching for information, whether it's about mining, oil and gas, forestry, or fishing, we've got a lot of information on there, not just specific to Guyana, but also to, to international links. If you're trying to research a story, you're interested in something specific. So please have a look. And again, I gratefully thank the Society for Environmental Journalists, all the participants. This has been really fantastic. Thank you very, very much. And thank you participants as well for joining in such lively discussions. Thank you.